Today's Take 5 with the Saints, April the 3rd, is Bishop Richard of Chichester, who is still to this day the patron saint of the region of Sussex in England. Richard was a person who, let's say, experienced the highs and lows of life. He was a person born into a noble family who yet struggled to make ends meet because of his parents' early death. He studied and was always a rigorous intellectual and ultimately worked his way into becoming a priest and then a bishop who, for the first couple of years of his service as a bishop, was effectively without a see because he had fallen out of favor with King Henry III. But Richard is also one of those whose life in service, his reform of the clergy as a bishop, and many of the words which have come down from his writings over the last 1,000 years have proven to be a great example of one whose resilience and faith have shown great fruit in helping to enrich and proclaim the gospel within the lands of England and the Anglican Church to this day. Scripture that goes with his feast day comes out of Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 through 13. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Richard indeed modeled those words of Paul, who was writing from his imprisonment and was writing about the fact that in feast or famine he would continue to proclaim the gospel no matter what. And this is the great legacy among many that we can take out of Richard's life. He was born around the year 1197. His parents were of a noble family in England, but as I mentioned earlier, they died when he and his brother Robert were fairly young. As such, they had an estate that they inherited, but because they were children and guardians were appointed to manage it. And for a variety of reasons, which we don't have time to go in here, his guardians both mismanaged the estate, but also did not advocate for Richard and his brother Robert because there were certain taxes that heirs had to pay on estates which were under the control of guardians that nearly impoverished them despite these wonderful lands and riches that were going to belong to them, so much that Richard actually had to work the family farm in order to help pay back some of the money that they owed during this period of guardianship. It was also during their teenage years that both Richard and his brother were being courted, so to speak, to noble ladies of other families. Robert later did marry, but Richard decided at a fairly young age that he did not want to marry. He wanted rather to study and to become an intellectual of some kind. And as such, he pronounced that so clearly, he not only didn't want to marry, but he also gave his share of the inheritance to his brother Robert. And as such, he basically lived a very simple life, to put it mildly, as he grew up. But he still had the resources to be able to attend Oxford. And despite the fact that he wasn't always sure where his next day's money was going to come from, or even sometimes his next meal, he found plenty of professors and clergy mentors who took him under his wing. One of the more notable ones was Robert Grosseteste, who was a very notable clergyman of that time period. He chose to study law. He was not initially going into theology or the ministry. He actually traveled to Paris and to Bologna, where he achieved his PhD in law. And returning to England, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Edmund Rich, or also known as Edmund of Abington, took a liking to young Richard and appointed him as his personal chancellor. It's a pretty good job for a young man to be essentially the private lawyer of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Not a bad gig at all. But he wasn't just working for the Archbishop, they became very close. The Archbishop took Richard under his wing as Richard provided him with great insight and advice on matters of ecclesiastical counsel. And as such, during his association with Archbishop Rich, he was ordained as a priest. But ultimately, as going to become a theme in Richard's life, Archbishop Rich became, let's just say, out of favor of King Henry III, who was one of the longest reigning monarchs in English history, but not one of the more stable monarchies in English history. Henry III exiled Edmund, and Richard, because of his loyalty, followed Edmund of Abington to France, where he was exiled in Orleans in particular, and ministered to him and also was his private nurse up until the Archbishop's passing. Richard stayed in France for quite a while, became enamored, and actually became a part of the Dominican house at Orleans, where finally, while he had gone under the studies with Archbishop Edmund of Abington, he was finally ordained in 1243, returning to England, where he became very shortly thereafter, in fact within a year, the Bishop of Chichester in 1244. Henry III, however, had another person in mind for this position, and he refused to recognize the ordination. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who succeeded Edmund, Boniface, wanted Richard as the bishop, but the king and the archbishop were at an impasse, and as such, King Henry essentially confiscated the lands of that diocese and even refused to allow Richard to be in his residency that the bishop was entitled to. It was during this time that Richard took this not as an opportunity to sulk or become involved in political intrigue, but he traveled around and visited with everyone in his diocese, which at that point in English history was not a very common thing. He toured and visited fishermen, the peasants, all the people in the countryside. He visited his clergy personally and reformed and instituted reforms, and even chided and defrocked one clergy for enticing nuns into special favors. Let's leave it at that. He was very upright and very rigid in his standards, but he also, in particular, wanted his clergy to be well educated and to be well read in scriptures and theology. Finally, Richard was ultimately acknowledged, although not formally or not actually accepted, but acknowledged at least by Henry III when the Pope threatened to excommunicate Henry if he did not recognize Richard as the sole and rightful bishop of that diocese. He served for 8 years, dying in 1253, where he contracted the plague. But he was canonized shortly after his death, and one of the famous prayers that is associated with, that comes out of his writings that we have, is a prayer that might be familiar to a number of you, a very wonderful, simple prayer. Dear Lord, of thee 3 things I pray: to see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly. Richard of Chichester, a bishop who continued to faithfully pastor to his flock no matter the circumstances, and who wrote and taught and offered wonderful writings and education and sermons for the people of his diocese, and whose life was lived as an example of one through prosperity and adversity to keep following as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining me. Our feast day tomorrow is April the 4th, a person who you might have heard before, Martin Luther King Jr., as we commemorate the anniversary of his assassination on April 4th, 1968. This is where we find him officially in our calendar of saints for the Episcopal Church. Look forward to seeing you then. Take care.